Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events, issues, and people. The people we're analyzing today are Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. They are the outlaws who are just known by their first names, Bonnie and Clyde. They have been romanticized as young lovers who stood by each other and lived life on their own terms. In reality, Clyde was a thief and a cold-blooded murderer, and Bonnie was his willing accomplice. Throughout this episode, I will sometimes be referring to peace officers or lawmen, and in those days, they were all men. The reason I'm doing so is because sometimes there were policemen, sheriffs, deputies, town constables, state police, Texas Rangers, or FBI agents. In my research on this topic, it is sometimes unclear what a particular law enforcement person's title was, so it's easier to just call them lawmen or peace officers. In the 1930s, during the depths of the Great Depression, there were gangsters that robbed banks and other businesses and murdered many people along the way. Because of the economic hard times and their glamorous portrayal in the movies, these gangsters became celebrities. 90 years later, we still know the names of John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson. The careers of all of these Depression-era criminals were very short. The crime spree of Bonnie and Clyde lasted a little over 2 years. And most of Bonnie and Clyde's criminal career was miserable, violent, and not at all glamorous. During their time on the run from the law, they often slept in their car or camped in open fields. A lot of the time, they were eating out of cans and had to bathe in rivers or lakes. I'll explain later on how Bonnie and Clyde became legends in their own time. But first, a little background about these two people. Let's start with Clyde Chestnut Barrow. You sometimes see his middle name listed as Champion instead of Chestnut because that's the way he listed it on some occasions. Clyde was born on March 24, 1909, although some claim it was 1910. For today's episode, I'm going with 1909 because that's usually listed as his birth year. He was born just outside of Tellico, Texas. That's a small town south of Dallas with a population of about 50 people at that time. Clyde was the fifth of 7 children. As I'll outline later, his older brother Marvin, who everybody called Buck, played a big role in today's episode. When Clyde was born, the family lived on a rented farm in a 3-room shack. Obviously, they were very poor. They often did not have enough to eat. They mostly grew cotton. In 1922, when Clyde was 13, the family left the farm and moved to the slums of unincorporated West Dallas. They were incredibly poor before the Great Depression. Although it was not the sole cause of the Great Depression, the crash of the New York stock market in October 1929 is generally considered the start of the biggest economic recession in the history of the United States. Clyde dropped out of school in the 6th grade. He took manual labor jobs. Clyde was a criminal before he met Bonnie Parker. He was first arrested in 1926 for stealing an automobile. Clyde claimed he had rented the car and simply failed to return it on time. Since the car was recovered, the charges were dropped. But soon, Clyde was stealing cars on a regular basis. In the late 1920s, cars had become fairly common in America because of the inexpensive models produced by Ford, as well as General Motors introducing a credit plan for purchasing an automobile. Besides stealing and selling stolen cars, Clyde was also busy with burglaries throughout the Dallas area. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1, 1910 in Rowena, Texas. Bonnie was her given name. It was not a nickname for some formal name. Rowena was a small town about a couple of 100 miles or about 300 or so kilometers southwest of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. She had an older brother and a younger sister. Her father died when Bonnie was 4 years old. Her mother moved the family to West Dallas in an area known as Cement City. As an adult, she was tiny. I've seen her listed as 5 feet tall and sometimes only 4 foot 10 inches. That's somewhere around 150 centimeters. She weighed less than 100 pounds or less than 45 kilos. She had curly blonde hair and blue eyes, although when she and Clyde were on the run, she dyed her hair red. She was married only once, and it's not who you think. She married a man named Roy Thornton on September 25, 1926. That was 6 days before her 16th birthday. Yeah, you heard me. She got married at 15 years old. Thornton was often in trouble with the law and left Bonnie alone for long stretches of time, sometimes weeks at a time. They became permanently separated in 1929, but they never got divorced. Shortly after they separated for good, Roy Thornton was convicted of burglary and sent to prison. Bonnie never saw him again. Bonnie and Clyde were never married, since she was still married to Roy Thornton. Bonnie continued to wear her wedding ring from Thornton and was wearing it the day she died. Thornton was killed while trying to escape the Texas State Prison in Huntsville on October 3, 1937. After separating from her husband, Bonnie moved back in with her mother. She was working as a waitress in a cafe. There are conflicting versions of how Bonnie and Clyde met, but it appears that they met in the early part of 1930 when Clyde was 20 years old and Bonnie was 19. They started seeing each other on a regular basis. But shortly after they met, Clyde was arrested for burglary. In March 1930, he was transferred to a jail in Waco, Texas. Clyde pled guilty and was sentenced to 2 years. While in the local jail in Waco, before being transferred to the state prison in Huntsville, Clyde escaped with 2 other prisoners, William Turner and Emery Abernathy. This occurred on March 11, 1930. They used a gun to force the guards to let them out. But where did they get the handgun? Bonnie smuggled the gun into Clyde. She hid the gun inside her clothes. Apparently, Bonnie and Clyde were both correct that the police officers would not pat down a woman to see if she was concealing any weapons. Surprisingly, Bonnie was never suspected of smuggling the pistol into Clyde. This is when Bonnie crossed the line from simply being the girlfriend of a criminal to being a criminal herself. About a week or so later, the 3 escapees were caught in Middletown, Ohio, after a robbery. As a result of the robbery and the escape, Clyde was sentenced to 14 years. Clyde was sent to the Eastham State Prison Farm. In those days, some of the Texas prisons included large properties where the prisoners did hard labor in agricultural fields. They worked around 10 hours a day in the fields. Prisoners were regularly whipped or beaten by the guards. While incarcerated in Eastham, Clyde was physically and sexually abused by an older inmate. He was not very big, at most 5'6" or 167 centimeters tall, and 130 pounds or 59 kilos. Purportedly, Clyde killed the prisoner who was sexually abusing him, but it appears that Clyde was never charged with that murder. To try to get out of the harsh physical labor, Clyde actually cut off 2 toes on one of his feet. This caused a limp for the rest of his life. Shortly after mutilating his foot, Clyde was paroled from Eastham in February 1932. This had nothing to do with the loss of the toes. He served only 2 years in prison. And of course, being paroled so early in his 14-year sentence, Clyde decided that he never wanted to go to prison again, so he gave up his criminal lifestyle and got a regular job. Obviously, that's not what happened. As soon as he got out of prison, Bonnie and Clyde started a crime spree that lasted about 2 years and 3 months. What was going on in the country at that time? 1932 was the worst year of the Depression. Approximately 1/4 of the entire workforce was out of a job. That was also the year of the bonus army. World War I veterans had been awarded a bonus from the federal government for their service to their country. The bonus was supposed to be paid in 1945. Because of the Great Depression, these veterans marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932 to demand an early payment of their World War I bonuses. Congress refused, but the vets remained in Washington, D.C. Somewhere around 40,000 people, the veterans and their families, were camping out in public places. Herbert Hoover was president at the time. He ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear out the bonus army. On July 28, 1932, MacArthur greatly exceeded his authority and used armed soldiers and even tanks to remove the World War I vets. He also ordered his soldiers to burn the shanties where the vets and their families had been living in Washington, D.C. To most Americans, it did not appear that the Hoover administration was doing anything to alleviate the Depression. That perception, along with the terrible images of the U.S. Army physically removing and destroying the campgrounds of the World War I veterans, made the government very unpopular with a lot of Americans. In addition, banks were generally hated because so many of them had gone under and people could not recover their money. Anything they had in a bank which closed was gone forever. And the banks that were still in business had foreclosed on many homes and farms. In general, banks were extremely unpopular. The reason I'm outlining these conditions is to demonstrate why some of these criminals in the early 1930s were cheered on by segments of the populace. The criminals were sticking it to the banks and even the government. Those attitudes started to change in November 1932 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, and immediately instituted the New Deal, his program to alleviate the hardships of the Depression. The animosity towards the government mostly evaporated. This helped reduce the popularity of the gangsters. After being paroled, Clyde committed crimes with Ralph Fultz, who Clyde met in prison, and another guy named Raymond Hamilton. Bonnie was an accomplice. They robbed banks and burglarized homes. But after a while, Hamilton split from Clyde and eventually got arrested. Fultz continued to ride with Bonnie and Clyde as they robbed various businesses. At one point, Fultz and Bonnie were captured by the police, but Clyde got away. Fultz was convicted of several crimes and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Bonnie was held in a local Kaufman County, Texas jail while a grand jury considered whether to indict her. The grand jury did not charge her and she was released. Why? It's because they just couldn't believe a woman could be committing these crimes. In the summer of 1932, Raymond Hamilton rejoined the Barrow Gang. He was also young like Bonnie and Clyde. He was only 19 years old at the time. In this episode, I'm not listing all of the Barrow Gang's crimes because I think it would become kind of tedious. I'm just highlighting some of the violations of the law to give you a flavor of what they were up to. An example, at some point in the summer of 1932, they robbed a company's payroll. In midsummer 1932, Bonnie stayed at her mother's house in Dallas when Clyde, Raymond Hamilton, and two other men went to Stringtown, Oklahoma. On August 5, 1932, the four men were at an outdoor party or county fair with music and dancing when two sheriffs approached the outlaws. Clyde and Raymond Hamilton shot the two sheriffs and one died. Clyde and Hamilton both got away. After this killing, Bonnie and Clyde, along with Raymond Hamilton, went to New Mexico to let things cool down. They were staying at a house in Carlsbad, New Mexico when, on August 14, 1932, a deputy sheriff arrived at the house. Clyde, Bonnie, and Hamilton kidnapped the deputy and fled. They let the deputy go hundreds of miles away in San Antonio, Texas. Bonnie and Clyde continued their life of crime. On October 11, 1932, in Sherman, Texas, Clyde robbed a local store and killed one of the workers. In the fall of 1932, Bonnie accidentally shot herself in the foot. Or maybe she didn't. With Bonnie and Clyde, there are a lot of contradictory stories. So it's unclear whether this really occurred or not. If it did happen, there were no permanent injuries. This is actually a good time for a general disclaimer about the careers of Bonnie and Clyde. Sometimes there is hard evidence like court records or police reports, but most of the time we just have oral reports that are given sometimes years after these events occurred, and often it's just hearsay. This is why we have a lot of contradictory evidence about who did what, when, and where. In the autumn of 1932, Raymond Hamilton left the Barrow Gang. William Daniel Jones, who everybody called WD, started running with Bonnie and Clyde at Christmas time 1932. Clyde and WD were stealing a car on Christmas Day, December 25, 1932, in Temple, Texas, when Clyde shot the owner, who died the next day. On January 6, 1933, Bonnie and Clyde, along with W.D. Jones, got into a gunfight with law officers. A deputy died. While in Springfield, Missouri in late January 1933, a motorcycle cop came up to the Barrow Gang. Clyde got the drop on the policeman, and they kidnapped the cop. They let the policeman go near Joplin, Missouri. Defenders of Bonnie and Clyde love to point out how they sometimes took hostages and then let those people go. See? They weren't such bad people. My answer is, so what? They still killed many people. The exact number is disputed, but most people settle on 13 murders by Clyde Barrow. The fact that they didn't kill some others does not absolve them of the murders they did commit. Remember earlier when I told you that Clyde had an older brother named Marvin that everybody called Buck? In March 1933, Buck Barrow was released from prison. He was pardoned by the governor of Texas, Miriam Ferguson. She was commonly known as Ma Ferguson. Love that name. On April 1, 1933, Bonnie and Clyde, along with W.D. Jones, rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Joplin, Missouri. Buck and his wife, Blanche, joined Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. in Joplin. A neighbor noticed that the people in this apartment always had the curtains drawn closed, and he thought this was suspicious. That neighbor contacted the police because he thought there were possibly bootleggers or criminals of some other type who were in this apartment. On the afternoon of April 13, 1933, 5 law officers came to the apartment to investigate. Clyde and W.D. were in the garage when the 2 police cars pulled up. As soon as the police officers got out of their cars, a major gunfight ensued. W.D. was shot in the side but would survive. Clyde was shot in the chest. Amazingly, he wasn't seriously injured. Bonnie, Clyde, W.D., Buck, and Blanche all got into one car and were able to flee the scene. 1 police officer was dead and another one was dying. The police searched the apartment. They found the marriage certificate of Buck and Blanche, which clearly identified 2 of the gang members. But the most amazing thing they found was a camera with film in it. The camera belonged to Blanche. The police had the photos developed. It was these photos that turned Bonnie and Clyde into legends. Up until that time, they were known in Texas and some of the neighboring states, but once these photos were printed in newspapers and magazines across the country, everybody knew Bonnie and Clyde. The pictures showed a good-looking young couple being playful. They didn't seem like monsters at all. There were photos of Bonnie and Clyde in front of a car. Clyde is wearing a nice suit, and Bonnie is wearing a sweater, a long skirt, and a beret. 3 pictures became the most famous. The first showed Bonnie pointing a shotgun at Clyde while reaching for a pistol tucked into his waistband as if she was disarming him. The second photo was Clyde standing in front of the car while he held Bonnie in his left arm above his shoulder. But probably the most famous photo showed Bonnie with her left foot on the front bumper of the car as she leaned on the car's headlight. She's holding a pistol in her right hand and she has a cigar in her mouth. That photo later bugged Bonnie. She told anybody who would listen that she did not smoke cigars, she smoked cigarettes. The photo was a joke and it annoyed her that the public thought she actually smoked cigars. She borrowed the cigar from W.D. Jones for the photo. These pictures made Bonnie and Clyde household names. There were plenty of gangsters robbing and killing, but Clyde Barrow was committing crimes and doing flashy getaways with a pretty girlfriend. This was different. A lot of gangsters had girlfriends, or molls to use the term from the 1930s, but only Bonnie was participating in the actual crimes. Some people correctly saw them as murderous criminals, but others saw them as a glamorous young couple that were in love and leading an exciting life in the midst of the misery of the Great Depression. There were other photos with Clyde and WD, but it was the pictures of Bonnie Parker that caught the imagination of the nation. She was no longer an unidentified female accomplice. Her name was now known nationwide. The Barrow gang committed a series of robberies in Texas and the Great Plains section of the U.S. Clyde was in charge, even though Buck was several years older. Clyde did all the driving. He was considered a very good driver, and one reason the Barrow gang avoided capture so long was because Clyde would drive hundreds of miles in one day or night to put a lot of distance between the gang and the scene of their latest crime. On June 10, 1933, in Wellington, Texas, Clyde, Bonnie, and WD got into a bad car accident. Bonnie got seriously hurt. There's a dispute as to whether she got burned by fire or battery acid on her leg. Whichever it was, she seriously limped the rest of her life. Clyde carried Bonnie to a nearby house after the accident. While at that house, 2 cops came to investigate. The outlaws kidnapped those 2 cops and released them many miles away. Let's talk a little bit about their weapons. When you think of gangsters of the 1920s and 1930s, you usually think of the Thompson submachine gun, commonly known as the Tommy gun. World War I was a time when heavy, non-portable machine guns dominated the battlefield. The U.S. Army needed a lightweight machine gun. Brigadier General John Thompson was the chief of the Small Arms Division of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. Thompson was in charge of the development of a portable machine gun using .45 caliber bullets. These were the bullets used in the pistols carried by the American Army. The large machine guns which were set up on the ground used much bigger bullets. Because of the use of the smaller, pistol-sized ammunition, the Thompson was called a submachine gun. By the time the Thompson was manufactured, World War I was over. What was the manufacturer to do? The Thompson submachine guns were sold to civilians. You could even buy them through the mail. But Clyde did not like the Thompson. His weapon of choice was the Browning automatic rifle, commonly known as the BAR. This gun was also designed for use in World War I. It got its name because it was designed by a man named John Browning. The BAR used a .30-06 bullet, which was significantly larger, with a more powerful cartridge than used in the Thompson submachine gun. This much larger bullet had much greater range and caused more damage and injuries. The BAR could pierce a lot of barriers which might stop a bullet from the Thompson. Where did Clyde get these military rifles? He liked to break into National Guard armories to steal guns and ammunition. He did this several times. It wasn't just Bonnie and Clyde, but a lot of Depression-era bandits were making headlines and capturing the imagination of the public. The breaking point occurred on June 17, 1933, in an incident which is known as the Kansas City Massacre. A federal prisoner named Frank Jelly Nash was being transported by 3 peace officers from Fort Smith, Arkansas, to Kansas City by train. When they arrived in Kansas City, they were met by federal and local officers. As the peace officers placed Jelly Nash into a car, 3 or 4 gunmen approached and opened fire. There's a dispute as to the number of gunmen. The criminals were there to try to free their friend Nash. A shootout occurred. Nash was killed along with 4 peace officers. The gunman got away. There's an ongoing dispute as to whether Pretty Boy Floyd was one of the gunmen. As a result of the Kansas City Massacre, President Franklin Roosevelt declared a war on crime. He ordered changes to the FBI although it had a different name then. This essentially led to the creation of the FBI as we know it. Up through the early part of the 20th century, law enforcement was strictly a local affair. Criminal statutes were created by the states. City, county, and state law enforcement personnel only had jurisdiction within their particular city, county, or state. This often led to the absurd situation when peace officers were chasing criminals but had to stop if the criminals crossed the state line. A federal agency was necessary. Prior to 1908, the Justice Department had no investigators. If they needed investigators, they borrowed them from the Secret Service. At that time, the Secret Service was part of the Treasury Department. In 1908, President Teddy Roosevelt told his Attorney General Charles Bonaparte that a national peacekeeping organization was necessary. And in case you recognize that last name, supposedly the Attorney General was the great-nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. By the way, 1908 was the year that Ford started selling the Model T. That was the first affordable car. It was mass-produced and relatively cheap. It sold like crazy. By 1927, when they were phased out, Ford sold over 15 million Model Ts. The significance to today's episode is that America was becoming a country where a large percentage of the population had an automobile. Cars assisted criminals. Cars made getaways a lot easier. Getting back to the FBI. In 1908, Bonaparte created his own Department of Investigators. July 26, 1908 is considered the birthday of the FBI. Originally, this group of agents was known as the Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau of Investigation agents originally conducted examinations and analysis, but were not true law enforcement officers. But following the Kansas City massacre, Congress authorized the Bureau of Investigation agents to carry firearms, and they were given the power to make arrests. However, it seems that before that law was passed, Bureau agents were already carrying guns. They just needed to comply with state and local laws, particularly with regard to the concealment of firearms. In 1935, the name officially changed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. The FBI had jurisdiction to go after these famous Depression-era gangsters like Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, etc., because when these criminals crossed state lines in the commissions of their crimes, federal jurisdiction kicked in. Also, in 1934, bank robbery became a federal crime. In July 1933, the Barrow gang was staying at the Red Crown Tourist Court near Platte City, Missouri. A tourist court was a precursor to modern motels. They rented 2 cabins for the 5 people: Bonnie, Clyde, Buck, Blanche, and W.D. Somehow, the local sheriff became convinced that the people staying there were the Barrow gang. On July 19, 1933, a dozen lawmen with an armored car went to the Red Crown Tourist Court. Of course, a shootout occurred between the gang and the lawmen. Buck Barrow was shot in the head. Blanche was hit in her eye by some glass from a shattered car window. She eventually lost sight in that eye permanently. The Barrow gang got away. Clyde drove the group to Iowa. They spent the night in a field. Incredibly, Buck was still alive with a shot to the head. In Iowa, a local sheriff received a tip about outlaws camping out in a field. The sheriff assembled several peace officers. On July 24, 1933, the lawmen surrounded the campsite. Of course, another shootout occurred. Clyde was shot in his shoulder. Bonnie was also injured. The peace officers shot up the gangsters' car so they couldn't drive away. Buck could not run, and Blanche refused to leave him. Bonnie, Clyde, and W.D. fled on foot. They crossed the river. Clyde stole a car, and the 3 of them got away. Buck and Blanche were caught. Buck was shot in the gunfight and died, and Blanche was arrested. There's a famous photo of Blanche as she's being arrested in that field. In the picture, she is screaming. She later claimed that she could not see very well from her one good eye and thought she was about to be shot instead of having her photo taken. A few months later, when Clyde and Bonnie had both recovered from their wounds, W.D. Jones left the Barrow gang for good. W.D. returned to his mother's home in Houston and tried to lead a regular life working on local farms. But he was eventually recognized and arrested for one of the Barrow gang murders that occurred in Texas. He was convicted, but presumably because of his young age, he was only sentenced to 15 years in prison. On January 16, 1934, Clyde freed 5 convicts from the Eastham State Prison farm. That was the prison where Clyde served 2 years. The main purpose of the prison break was Clyde wanted to get his friend Raymond Hamilton out of Eastham. Remember him from earlier? Clyde hid some guns in the fields where the prisoners would be working. He somehow got a message to Hamilton where and when he could find these guns. 5 prisoners used these guns on the guards to escape. One of the guards was shot and killed, and another guard was seriously wounded. One of the prisoners who escaped was Joseph Palmer. He was the one who killed the guard. In 1935, Joseph Palmer was executed in the electric chair in Texas for the murder of that Eastham prison guard. Raymond Hamilton was also executed in the electric chair, apparently on the same day as Joe Palmer. It's unclear whether Hamilton was executed for the murder of the Eastham prison guard or another murder. One of the 5 prisoners that escaped was Henry Methvin. He joined the Barrow gang. As I'll explain later, he played a key role in the end of Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde were seen as kind of celebrities in Texas and the neighboring states. Although that term did not exist then, they were the anti-heroes of their time. This image changed on Easter Sunday, April 1, 1934, when they killed 2 police officers in Grapevine, Texas. Clyde, Bonnie, and Henry Methvin were in their parked car on the side of the road when 2 motorcycle policemen approached them. Witnesses from a nearby farm saw the outlaws kill the 2 policemen. A witness claimed that he saw Bonnie finish off one of the policemen with a shotgun blast to the head while the cop was lying on the road. The widespread news coverage of this incident really changed the image of Bonnie and Clyde from being glamorous outlaws to being cold-blooded killers. A week later, a constable was killed in Oklahoma, and Clyde was the alleged shooter. The public sympathy for Bonnie and Clyde had evaporated. This brings up something disputed to this day. Did Bonnie ever shoot anybody? There are a lot of conflicting statements from people at the time. Some claim she never fired a gun. I don't believe that. With all of their shootouts with law enforcement, it's hard to believe that she stood by passively and did not fire any guns. And that witness in Grapevine, Texas saw her use the shotgun on that downed policeman. There's also a dispute as to whether Bonnie could drive a car. This was at a time when a lot of people did not know how to drive. It was certainly harder back then with stick shifts. My guess is that Bonnie could drive and may have done so, but who knows? Whether Bonnie actually shot somebody is irrelevant. Under U.S. law, the felony murder rule states that a defendant is guilty of murder when a person is killed during a felony, even if that particular defendant was not the one who actually killed the victim. I practiced law in California for 31 years, but always on the civil side, not criminal cases. But from my research, I believe that the only 2 states in the country that do not have the felony murder doctrine are Hawaii and Kentucky. Besides the application of the felony murder rule, at a minimum, Bonnie was an accomplice to the 13 or so murders committed by Clyde Barrow. She assisted him in his crimes. Under U.S. law, an accomplice to a murder is liable to the same extent as the person who committed the murder. Simply stated, whether Bonnie actually pulled a trigger or not, she was just as liable as Clyde for those murders. Now it's time to introduce you to Frank Hamer. He's often called Captain Frank Hamer because he was a captain in the Texas Rangers. In American history, some lawmen become famous because of the criminals that they took down. And I say men because it was all men in those days. Sheriff Pat Garrett became famous because he is the one that shot and killed Billy the Kid on July 14, 1881 in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Frank Hamer became a legend as the man who finally put an end to the crime spree of Bonnie and Clyde. Hamer was born on March 17, 1884 in Fairview, Texas. In 1906, he joined the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers started in the 1830s around the time of the Texan Revolution when Texas became independent from Mexico. The Rangers had various duties throughout the 1800s. They served as a combination of state police and a quasi-military unit patrolling the frontier and enforcing laws, and sometimes acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Hamer retired from the Texas Rangers in 1932. In 1934, Frank Hamer was contacted by Lee Simmons, the man who was running the Texas prison system. Simmons was determined to put an end to Clyde Barrow after that incident where Clyde helped 5 prisoners escape from the Eastham prison farm and the killing of the guard I described earlier. Simmons offered Hamer the job of ending the crime spree of Bonnie and Clyde. On February 10, 1934, Hamer accepted the job. Hamer was granted full authority by the governor of Texas, Ma Ferguson. Hamer brought in his friend and former Texas Ranger, Manny Galt, to help him catch the outlaw couple. Hamer contacted Dallas County Sheriff Richard Schmid since Bonnie and Clyde were from that county. Sheriff Schmid introduced Hamer to deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton because they had been trying to capture Bonnie and Clyde and were familiar with them. Hamer and Galt had authority only within the state of Texas, yet they tracked Bonnie and Clyde into other states. This was acting outside of the law. Only federal agents had the legal authority to pursue criminals in more than one state. The Bureau of Investigation was also hunting Bonnie and Clyde during that time. Frank Hamer learned that Bonnie and Clyde were spending a lot of time in northern Louisiana. In the spring of 1934, Henry Methvin was still riding with Bonnie and Clyde. The Barrow gang was using Henry's parents' farm as a hideout from time to time. Henry's father and mother made a deal with Frank Hamer. By the way, the father's first name was Ivy and the mother's first name was Avy. That had to be confusing. In exchange for the Methvin's help, Henry Methvin received a full pardon from the governor of Texas. The pardon agreement was also signed by Lee Simmons, the head of the Texas prison system, as well as the chief of Texas Highway Patrol, L.G. Fairs. This would not protect Henry from prosecution in other states. Supposedly, there was a promise from the Louisiana peace officers that they would not prosecute Henry Methvin if the plan worked to capture or kill Bonnie and Clyde. It appears there was nothing in writing to this effect. This was the best deal Henry Methvin was going to get. On May 23, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were killed by law enforcement officers outside the town of Sales in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. And for those of you not familiar with Louisiana, they do not have counties. Their administrative subdivisions are called parishes. One other state does not have counties. Alaska calls their subdivisions boroughs. There are currently 19 organized boroughs and 1 unorganized borough in Alaska. I'm not sure why one borough is considered unorganized. Although they are called parishes and boroughs, those governmental entities essentially act as counties in Louisiana and Alaska. In most states, counties are the principal governing entities below the state government. County governments usually take care of record keeping, such as birth certificates and marriage licenses, as well as construction and maintenance of roads, administering elections, and some law enforcement. Even Hawaii has counties. You would think that each island would be self-governing, but no. Maui County includes the islands of Maui, Lanai, Molokai, and Kaho'olaui. It would seem that counties or their equivalent are necessary for the proper functioning of states, right? Nope, not true. Although I've lived most of my life here in California, I was born and raised in Connecticut. In 1960, Connecticut abolished its county governments. Connecticut still has 8 counties, but the counties exist only as geographical regions without their own independent governments. And I'm sure you're wondering, if there are no county governments, how is Connecticut administered below the state level? It's the towns and cities. Connecticut is tiny. It's approximately 5,000 square miles or about 13,000 square kilometers. To put that into perspective, San Bernardino County here in California is approximately 4 times the size of the state of Connecticut. Connecticut is the 3rd smallest state after Rhode Island and Delaware. Because it is so tiny, every part of Connecticut belongs to a city or town. When you look at a map of Connecticut, there are no unincorporated areas. What does that mean, unincorporated areas? When you look at maps of California counties like San Bernardino or Los Angeles, there are city boundaries, and then there are parts of the counties that don't belong to any city or town. These areas are considered unincorporated. Those areas have to be administered by the county governments. Since Connecticut does not have any unincorporated areas and every single bit of the state is part of a particular city or town, there's no need for county governments. The same is true for the even smaller state of Rhode Island. Like Connecticut, Rhode Island has counties, but they are just geographical designations. The 39 cities and towns perform all local government functions. Fun fact, although it is the smallest state in the country, Rhode Island used to be the answer to a famous trivia question, which state has the longest official state name? The official name was the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. However, in 2020, the citizens of the state voted to remove the words "and Providence Plantations" from the official name. I'm not positive, but I believe it was because they did not like the word plantation with its association to slavery. Since 2020, it is simply the state of Rhode Island. And I know you're dying to know which state now has the longest name. It's claimed to be Rhode Island's neighbor, which is officially known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Okay, I know I sometimes go off on these tangents, but I can't help it when they are amusing facts that I find so interesting. Anyway, getting back to Frank Hamer and the killing of Bonnie and Clyde. This was an arranged ambush. Pursuant to his agreement to assist in the capture or killing of Bonnie and Clyde, on May 22, 1934, Henry Methvin separated himself from Bonnie and Clyde, probably in Shreveport, Louisiana. The usual pattern was if the group got split up, they would eventually meet at the Methvin family farm. Henry's father, Ivy, told Frank Hamer that Bonnie and Clyde would be driving down Louisiana State Highway 154 the next morning. That was the only road that led to the Methvin family farm. Despite its name, Louisiana State Highway 154 was a country road with just one lane in each direction. So Hamer lined up the ambush posse with a lot of firepower. They even had Browning automatic rifles, Clyde's favorite weapon. There were 6 lawmen in the ambush posse. Frank Hamer was the leader. His friend and former Texas Ranger Manny Galt, Dallas County deputies Ted Hinton and Bob Alcorn, a Louisiana sheriff named Henderson Jordan, and a Louisiana deputy named Prentice Oakley. Clyde was known for driving very fast. He drove that way to avoid people seeing them and anybody shooting at them. Hamer was worried about Bonnie and Clyde's car speeding past them very quickly and possibly getting away. Frank Hamer also wanted the car slowed down so that the 2 Dallas deputies, Ted Hinton and Bob Alcorn, could identify Bonnie and Clyde. Those 2 deputies were the only ones in the posse who had ever seen them. So Hamer devised a trap. Henry's father, Ivy, would have his truck in the road, jacked up with a tire off so it looked like he was changing a tire. It's unclear as to whether the truck was actually blocking the road or whether it was off to the side of the road. Since Bonnie and Clyde knew Ivy Methvin and would recognize his truck, they would presumably stop to help him. There's an ongoing dispute as to where Henry Methvin's father, Ivy, was located at the time of the ambush. Some people claim that he was in the road to flag down Bonnie and Clyde. Others contradict this because he probably would have been hit by all of the gunfire. Some claim that Ivy Methvin was handcuffed to a tree behind the lawman. Wherever Ivy Methvin was located, the plan worked. On the morning of May 23, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde, with nobody else in the car, drove down that country road to the Methvin family farm. Seeing Ivy's truck in the road, Clyde slowed down. The two Dallas deputies supposedly identified Bonnie and Clyde. It's not really clear whether the Dallas deputies identified the outlaws or did the 6 members of the posse just see a young man and a young woman in the car and presume that it was Bonnie and Clyde. There are conflicting reports from the people who were there as to whether or not the law enforcement officers gave Bonnie and Clyde a chance to surrender. But most people agree that they probably did not. From everything I've read on this matter, it appears that the 6 members of the posse simply opened fire. A few days after the ambush, the 2 Dallas County deputies, Ted Hinton and Bob Alcorn, went back to the scene of the ambush to film a recreation of the incident for the newsreels. In that recreation, they do not yell stop or halt. These peace officers were well aware of how deadly Clyde was, and they were not taking any chances. When Clyde slowed the car down, the posse opened fire. I've read conflicting reports as to whether the car came to a complete stop or had just slowed down when they opened fire. You can see photos and even a short video showing the car after the shooting. It is absolutely riddled with gunshots. Both Bonnie and Clyde were killed instantly. How many bullets were fired at Bonnie and Clyde? I've seen the car listed as having 112 or 120 bullet holes in it. It's estimated that somewhere between 130 to 160 or so bullets were fired at Bonnie and Clyde's car. Now let's talk about this killing of the famous outlaw couple. This wasn't justice, this was murder. Amazingly, at the time, the execution by firing squad of Bonnie and Clyde was considered acceptable, even applauded. They were cold-blooded murderers who had killed somewhere around 13 men and simply got what was coming to them. And although I find them fascinating, I do not find Bonnie and Clyde sympathetic. They were hardened criminals who murdered innocent people. But an ambush execution is totally unacceptable for 2 reasons. Number 1, what if the police killed the wrong couple? They were relying on the 2 Dallas County deputies, Ted Hinton and Bob Alcorn, to identify Bonnie and Clyde. But did those 2 deputies actually identify Bonnie and Clyde? It's unclear whether Clyde only slowed down the car or came to a complete stop before the 6 members of the posse opened fire. As I explained earlier, it's also unclear whether the 6 lawmen waited for an identification or simply opened fire on a young couple that they presumed were Bonnie and Clyde. How about if they shot up the wrong car and killed innocent people? This scenario is not that unlikely. It happened 1 month earlier when the forerunner of the FBI was trying to get John Dillinger. On April 22, 1934, federal agents had received a tip that John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and other members of the Dillinger gang were staying at a resort in the north woods of Wisconsin called Little Bohemia Lodge. The federal agents surrounded the area and cut off the one road in and out of Little Bohemia Lodge. 3 men had been drinking in the bar at the lodge that night. They had nothing to do with the Dillinger gang and weren't criminals. Those 3 men got in their car to leave. They had the radio on and the windows were up because it was cold in northern Wisconsin. As they were driving down the road to leave Little Bohemia, the federal agents yelled for them to stop. It was night and they did not see the agents and they did not hear the command to stop. So the federal agents opened fire on the car. They killed one of the men and severely injured the other 2. Amazingly, there were no repercussions. As far as I can tell, those federal agents were not prosecuted for murder. The federal agents were able to say, sorry, our bad. That's what happens when you just shoot at a vehicle because you think there are some fugitives in that car. Reason number 2 why we cannot allow police to set up an ambush and just execute people is because it is totally against the American criminal justice system. In the United States, everybody is presumed innocent until they are proven guilty in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. Most people know this cornerstone of American due process, but they don't know where it comes from. I think that most people believe it's written somewhere in the Constitution. Not true. At least it's not spelled out that way. This fundamental right comes from English common law and has been stated in American case law. This foundational principle of criminal law in the United States was addressed in the 1895 Supreme Court case of Coffin versus United States. The citation for that case is 156 U.S. 432. The Supreme Court stated, "A charge that there cannot be a conviction unless the proof shows guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, does not so entirely embody the statement of presumption of innocence as to justify the court in refusing, when requested, to instruct the jury concerning such presumption, which is a conclusion drawn by the law in favor of the citizen by virtue whereof, when brought to trial upon a criminal charge, he must be acquitted unless he is proven to be guilty." Later in that opinion, the Supreme Court stated, "The principle that there is a presumption of innocence in favor of the accused is the undoubted law, axiomatic and elementary, and its enforcement lies at the foundation of the administration of our criminal law." Although the phrase presumption of innocence is not specifically stated in the U.S. Constitution, the Fifth Amendment does contain the Due Process Clause, wherein it states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Originally, it was considered that the Bill of Rights only pertained to the federal government and not state governments. However, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution applied those rights to the states and specifically affirms, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The point of all this is that we have legal protections and due process if we, as Americans, are accused of a crime. We cannot allow law enforcement personnel to just decide who is guilty and lie in wait for suspected criminals and gun them down on sight. Yet this is what happened with Bonnie and Clyde. What were the consequences for these lawmen who killed Bonnie and Clyde? Nothing. Well, except praise. Some people have claimed that they heard rumors that Bonnie was pregnant when she died. I don't believe it. No credible source claims that she was pregnant, and it's not mentioned in the autopsy report. You would think the coroner would have listed an important fact like that. Contrary to what Bonnie predicted and hoped for, they were not buried side by side. Bonnie's mother would not allow it. Their funerals were held in 2 different funeral homes, and they were buried in 2 different cemeteries. It is estimated that around 50,000 people saw the 2 bodies in the 2 funeral homes. Of course, the car Bonnie and Clyde were driving on the day they were killed had been stolen. Clyde had stolen the Ford V8 from Jesse and Ruth Warren in Topeka, Kansas. Whenever possible, Clyde would steal a Ford V8 because it had a big engine and was faster than anything else on the road. When Clyde was behind the wheel of a Ford V8, there was no way law enforcement could catch them. Clyde liked that car so much that on April 10, 1934, he purportedly sent a letter to Henry Ford, the president of the Ford Motor Company. Some people question whether the letter was truly written by Clyde Barrow. I certainly like to think that he actually wrote it. Anyway, that letter is displayed in the Henry Ford Museum. Here's what the letter said. "Dear Sir, while I still have got breath in my lungs, I will tell you what a dandy car you make. I have drove Fords exclusively when I could get away with one. For sustained speed and freedom from trouble, the Ford has got every other car skinned, and even if my business hasn't been strictly legal, It don't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you got in the V8. Yours truly, Clyde Champion Barrow. You will note that he signed his name as Clyde Champion Barrow instead of using his actual middle name of Chestnut. The car they were driving when they were ambushed and killed is now known as the Bonnie and Clyde death car. After the killing of Bonnie and Clyde, the car was returned to its owners in Kansas and later sold. For years, the death car was exhibited at county fairs and carnivals around the country. In 1988, the car was sold to its current owner for $250,000, equivalent to approximately $670,000 in today's money. It's currently on display inside Buffalo Bill's Casino in Primm, Nevada. If you drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, there are a few casinos just across the state line when you enter Nevada. These are for the degenerate gamblers that can't drive the remaining 40 miles or 65 kilometers from the state line to Las Vegas. When I've driven to Vegas, it always killed me that people drive 5 hours from LA but feel the gambling Jones so bad that they can't last another half hour to Las Vegas and pull over in Primm, Nevada, right across the state line. I've never seen the death car, but the next time I go to Las Vegas, I will go to Buffalo Bill's Casino to see it. What happened to some of the people who were linked to Bonnie and Clyde? W.D. Jones served his time in prison and apparently led a crime-free life after he was released. However, he was shot and killed in 1974. Blanche Barrow, Buck's widow, was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was paroled after 6 years. Blanche remarried and apparently lived a quiet and crime-free life after her release from prison. She died in 1988 at the age of 77. While serving time in prison, Blanche wrote a memoir of her time with the Barrow gang. It was not published until after her death, when it was edited by a man named John Neal Phillips, who edited information from his interviews with Blanche. The book is titled My Life with Bonnie and Clyde. I have not read it. Because of the deal his father made, Henry Methvin was pardoned in Texas, but he did stand trial for the murder of a constable in Oklahoma. He received a life sentence but was paroled in 1942. He died in April 1948 when he was hit by a train. Frank Hamer lived to be 71 when he died in 1955. Something that really added to the romanticized version of Bonnie and Clyde is the fact that Bonnie Parker liked to write poetry. It's unclear how many poems she wrote. 2 of them became famous. One was called Suicide Sal. But the poem that's most well known was called The Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde. I have not been able to verify this, but it seems to me that until this poem was published in the newspapers, they were usually referred to as the Barrow Gang. But after this poem became famous, because of Bonnie's phrasing, they were known as Bonnie and Clyde. It's unclear when this poem was first published in the newspapers. Did the Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde get published before they died? I've tried to find this answer, but I just can't. I was able to find this poem published in a newspaper called the Austin American from Austin, Texas, the state capital. It was dated May 24, 1934, the day after they died. There are articles in that edition of that newspaper about the death of Bonnie and Clyde, but there's also a column printing the poem by Bonnie. Before the poem it reads, Editor's note, the Dallas Police Department Wednesday released the following as being the last poem written by Bonnie Parker. It came into possession of police a short time ago. Bonnie has on several occasions said her thoughts to verse. And then the newspaper printed the long poem, which I'm not going to read here because it kind of drags on. But it starts as follows. You've read the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, Bonnie and Clyde are the Barrow Gang. I'm sure you all have read how they rob and steal, and how those who squeal are usually found dying or dead. The poem then contains several stanzas basically portraying Bonnie and Clyde as sympathetic figures that the law enforcement agencies would just not leave alone. But here's the ending of the poem. Someday they'll go down together, they'll bury them side by side. To few it will be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you're listening on a podcast app, which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.